Hey friends, it's me, the Ebony Otaku, the well-rounded nerd. Full disclosure, it was date night tonight. She dressed up. Let's not waste the look, shall we? Um, you're in for a different kind of video today. I've not read from this particular author before, but I think you'll enjoy the story because I only pick good stories. And I pre-apologize for mispronouncing any names or words. She is African descended, not actually from an African nation. So there's that. Reading from Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Okonkwo ruled his household with a heavy hand. His wives, especially the youngest, lived in perpetual fear of his fiery temper, and so did his little children. Perhaps, down in his heart, Okonkwo was not a cruel man, but his whole life was dominated by fear. The fear of failure and weakness. It was deeper and more intimate than the fear of evil and capricious gods, and of magic. The fear of the forest and the forces of nature, malevolent, red in tooth and claw. Okonkwo's fear was greater than these. It was not external, but lay deep within himself. It was the fear of himself, lest he should be found to resemble his father. Even as a little boy, he had resented his father's failure and weakness. And even now, he still remembered how he had suffered when a playmate had told him that his father was Agbala. That was how Okonkwo first came to know that Agbala was not only another name for a woman, it could also mean a man who had taken no title. And so, Okonkwo was ruled by one passion: to hate everything that his father Anoka had loved. One of these things was gentleness, and another was idleness. During the planting season, Okonkwo worked daily in his farms, from cock-crow until the chickens went to roost. He was a very strong man and rarely felt fatigue. But his wives and young children were not as strong, so they suffered. But they dared not complain openly. Okonkwo's first son, Nwoye, was then 12 years old, but was already causing his father great anxiety for his insipid laziness. At any rate, that was how it looked to his father, and he sought to correct him by constant nagging and beating. And so Nwoye was developing into a sad-faced youth. Okonkwo's prosperity was visible in his household. He had a large compound enclosed by a thick wall of red earth. His own hut, or obi, stood immediately behind the only gate in the red walls. Each of his 3 wives had her own hut, which together formed half a moon behind the obi. The barn was built against one end of the red walls, and long stacks of yams stood out prosperously in it. At the opposite end of the compound was a shed for the goats, and each wife built a small attachment to her hut for the hens. Near the barn was a small house, the medicine house, or shrine, where Okonkwo kept the wooden symbols of his personal god and of his ancestral spirits. He worshipped them with sacrifices of kola nut, food, and palm wine, and offered prayers to them on behalf of himself, his 3 wives, and his 8 children. So, when the daughter of Umuofia was killed in Mbino, Ikemefuna came into Okonkwo's household. When Okonkwo brought him home that day, he called his most senior wife and hauled him over to her. He belongs to the clan, he told her. So look after him. Is he staying long with us? She asked. Do what you are told, woman, Okonkwo thundered and stammered. When did you become one of the Indisibe of Umofia? And so, Nwoye's mother took Ikemefuna to her hut and asked no more questions. As for the boy himself, he was terribly afraid. He could not understand what was happening to him or what he had done. How could he know that his father had taken a hand in killing a daughter of Umofia? All he knew was that a few men had arrived in their house, conversing with his father in low tones, and at the end, he had been taken out and handed over to a stranger. His mother had wept bitterly, but he had been too surprised to weep. And so the stranger had brought him and a girl a long, long way from home, through lonely forest paths. He did not know who the girl was, and he never saw her again. If you have never read this novel, you need to treat yourself. I will say it is a hard read in some places. So I would compare it to being a hard read to something like Snowflower and the Secret Fan, or maybe even something like Elie Wiesel's Night, where the author takes you through an experience of things that have happened. And those things are not always pleasant, but they're real. And it's within the real stories that can be told in such a way that brings you in, that gets you interested in a world outside yourself, where magic of understanding can happen. So, I guess spoilers for a classic novel that I believe is in open domain now. This is the story of a man and a boy. And Okonkwo is our central character. He is the son of a man who, at least in Okonkwo's perception, was lazy. Didn't amount to much. The family that he grew up in with his father was poor. They didn't have enough to eat, and Okonkwo tells us from his own mouth that he was made fun of by other children for his father not being a great man. If you know anything about tribal type cultures, and when I say tribal, that's not necessarily meaning people who live in a non-technological advanced world. Tribal literally means family groups that stick together. That's what a tribe is. There are tribes in metropolitan cities. That's why there are neighborhoods named for ethnicities. But in a lot of the African countries, a lot of the Asian countries, and South American countries, tribalism is the establishment of society, a group of people with common interests who decide that their familial bonds are strong enough that they will keep and hold community together. They share their wealth with one another. They share the raising of children. They find spouses for their children amongst their tribe. They keep their bloodline as resilient as it possibly can. And then if there is an outside threat or outside force to this group that's been formed, they work together to right that wrong in whatever way that seems fit. And between the tribes, there's usually an establishment of how they should interact. I think one of the best modern examples that's easy to access would be the caste system of India. Now, I'm not Indian, obviously, um, but it's another set of mores that are really interesting, especially when it comes to marriage and that type of thing. But India still has a caste system right now. And when you're born into a particular caste in a particular tribe, your social status and who you should marry is all found within the caste that you're born into. That's just the system. It's not a comment on right and wrong. It just simply is. But it's the closest modern comparison I can think of that's easy to look up, study, and see where this might be coming. Because we know throughout the African countries, there are thousands upon thousands of people groups. In Asia, there are thousands upon thousands of people groups. There is a TikToker that shows up in the newsfeed on YouTube, because I don't have TikTok and I never will. But I do like a reel on the YouTube, and I will doom scroll just like everyone else. But there's a particular creator out of China that I love because she showcases the beauty of traditional garments. There's another Ugandan TikToker that I follow, and I love her so much because she always talks about, people call my country a third world country, and yet I can go outside my front door and pick fruit off of a tree and go feed my family. Like, she's amazing. I love her. Like, why wouldn't I be happy here? Because I don't have a washing machine. I wash my clothes with the cleanest water on earth. Like, she's great. I love her. And it's all about perspective. It's perspective and lived experience. But when you look at these different cultures and cultures within cultures and cultures within cultures within cultures, what I love about these types of stories is, we hear so much in the modern world about how bad things have gotten. And if you study history and you read stories, you realize people have not actually changed that much. We've always been this way. There's just, more access to information now in real time that we never had before. And what, for me at least, it gives me comfort is that we're not as bad as people think we are. Like, there's actually hope out there. Because there have also been periods of history where people have done things that were just atrocious, but then also at some point atoned for them and made right. And we see that throughout so many cultural histories. Where this story really becomes powerful is how Okonkwo is changed into the forced care of this boy. So in Okonkwo's tribe, a daughter of one of his neighbors was kidnapped, presumably, word I can't say, and then she was killed by another tribe. And as recompense for that, members of Okonkwo's tribe, it's either war or you give us children in payment for the life that was taken. A boy is taken and a girl is taken. The boy is sent to live in Okonkwo's house. We don't know what happens to that girl. And we probably can guess. And it's not pleasant if you read between the lines in the subtext. But now he's forced to take care of this boy. So Okonkwo has worked his whole life to not be his father. From his perspective, his father never achieved anything that mattered. And I find that just so amazing because in Western culture, westernized culture, in industrial culture, that's a better word, industrialized culture, there's this expectation of becoming something. And in my part of the world, a lot of people don't think you can become something if you are from a low-tech existence. That becoming something involves, our way of life, that you went to the right schools, you knew the right people, that wealth is established by how much money you have in the bank and how many investments and the house and the cars and all of that. And depending on the culture norms that you're brought up in, that might not matter to you at all. In Okonkwo's culture, what matters is a man who can feed his family. A man who can feed his family well can have a bigger family, so he can have more wives who can bear him more children. It's the fact that he could build a big compound for his family. He has lots of livestock. His family eats well. He is a well-respected man. He adheres to all the traditions the way he should. He rules his household with an iron fist. He is raising his children to be strong, and he's got a son that's not being as strong as he wants him to be, and he's going to fix that boy if he has his way. So in the context, and context is so important with literature, but in the context of Okonkwo's culture, he is a great success. He is not what his father was. But his first son, ooh, that boy. That boy he's not getting with the program. He's not doing what he's supposed to be doing. This refuses to stay where it's supposed to be. So whatever. Had it on for a while. But Okonkwo is so frustrated because he's worked so hard to not be his father. But genes are strong. You ever work hard? Like, I know so many parents who are like, I work so hard for them not to turn out this way. And yeah, well, you have a bloodline. And, they're going to get some traits from people who aren't you. So Uncle Leroy that you acted like wasn't real. Yeah, well, they got Uncle Leroy's traits. Sorry. We all have an Uncle Leroy. You know who they are. But Okonkwo is given this extra child. And at first, he's not particularly pleased about it. He's doing it because he's a senior in his tribe. He has shown he can raise a good household. The reward for good work is more work. And to be fair, the boy is not mistreated by these standards. And there even comes a point where Okonkwo looks at this young boy as basically his replacement for his son. He ends up being stronger, better in all ways, more intelligent, more successful, better hunter, better fisher, better everything than his actual blood-born son. And he and this young boy actually become very close over the years. And he ends up growing up in Okonkwo's household. Now, the ending to this book, it hurts. I'm going to read the ending of the book. I just told you what's going to happen. He's going to raise his kid, and they're going to be besties. He's going to look at him like he's his own son. He's going to fully integrate in the family and be there for years. But you have to remember why that boy is there. He is the price, a life for a life, because the tribe he is from took the life of a tribe member of Okonkwo's. And eventually, the creditor will come calling for the debt to be paid. And through the book, we see Okonkwo's character change. He has an amazing character arc. And maybe I'll read more of this book, sometime in the future. But even though I'm going to read the ending, I read the ending of, A Christmas Carol over the holidays. These are classic books. You should have read them anyway. But please go give this one a read. I do believe it's in the public domain now, and if not, you can pick it up at any bookstore for not a lot of money. This is unfortunately, even though it's a classic book, when classics are classic for long enough, they also become bargain. So get to your Second and Charles or your what are other big ones, like your used bookstore in your area, and go pick you up one, because it's a good one. So I warned you, and you're still here. So let's see how the story ends. For 3 years, Ikemefuna lived in Okonkwo's household, and the elders of Umuofia seemed to have forgotten about him. He grew rapidly like a yam tendril in the rainy season and was full of the sap of life. He had become wholly absorbed into his new family. He was like an elder brother to Nwoye, and from the very first seemed to have kindled a new fire in the younger boy. He made him feel grown up, and they no longer spent evenings in a mother's hut while she cooked, but now sat with Okonkwo in his obi, or watched him as he tapped his palm tree for the evening wine. Nothing pleased Nwoye more than to be sent for by his mother and or another of his father's wives to do one of those difficult and masculine tasks in the home, like splitting wood or pounding food. On receiving such a message through a younger brother or sister, Nwoye would feign annoyance and grumble aloud about women and their troubles. Okonkwo was inwardly pleased at his son's development, and he knew it was due to Ikemefuna. He wanted Nwoye to grow into a tough young man, capable of ruling his father's household when he was dead and gone to join the ancestors. He wanted him to be a prosperous man, having enough in his barn to feed the ancestors with regular sacrifices. And so he was always happy when he heard him grumbling about women. That showed that in time he would be able to control his womenfolk. No matter how prosperous a man was, if he was unable to rule his women and his children, and especially his women, he was not really a man. He was like a man in the song who had 10 and 1 wives and not enough soup for his fufu. So, Okonkwo encouraged the boys to sit with him in his obi, and he told them stories of the land, masculine stories, of violence and bloodshed. Nwoye knew that it was right to be masculine and to be violent, but somehow he still preferred the stories that his mother used to tell, and which she no doubt still told to her younger children. Stories of the tortoise and why his wily ways, and of the bird, the Inke Inti Oba, who challenged the whole world to a wrestling contest and was finally thrown by a cat. He remembered the story she often told of the quarrel between the earth and the sky. Long ago, how sky withheld rain for 7 years until crops withered and the dead could not be buried because the hose broke on the stony earth. At last, Vulture was sent to plead with Sky to soften his heart with a song of suffering of the sons of men. Whenever Nwoye's mother sang this song, he felt carried away to the distant scene in the sky where Vulture, Earth's emissary, sang for mercy. At last, Sky was moved to pity, and he gave to Vulture rain wrapped in leaves of a cocoyam. But as he flew home, his talon pierced the leaves, and the rain fell as it had never fallen before. And so heavily did it rain on Vulture that he did not return to deliver his message, but flew to a distant land from where he espied a fire. And when he got there, he found it was a man making a sacrifice. He warmed himself in the fire and ate the entrails. That was the kind of story Nwoye loved, but he now knew that they were foolish for women and children, and he knew that his father wanted him to be a man. And so he feigned that he no longer cared for women's stories. And when he did, he saw that his father was pleased and no longer rebuked him or beat him. So Nwoye and Ikemefuna would listen to Okonkwo's stories about tribal wars, or how years ago he had stalked his victim, overpowered him, and obtained his first human head. As he told them of the past, they sat in darkness or the dim glow of logs, waiting for the women to finish their cooking. When they finished, each brought her bowl of fufu and a bowl of soup to her husband. An oil lamp was lit, and Okonkwo tasted from each bowl, and then passed 2 shares to Nwoye and Ikemefuna. In this way, the moons and seasons passed, and then the locust came. It had not happened for many a long year. The elders said locusts came once in a generation, reappeared every year for 7 years, and then disappeared for another lifetime. They went back to their caves in a distant land, where they were guarded by a race of stunted men. And then, after another lifetime, these men opened the caves again, and locusts came to Umuofia. They came in the cold Harmattan season after the harvest had been gathered, and they ate up all the wild grass in the fields. Okonkwo and the 2 boys were working on the red outer walls of the compound. This was one of the lighter tasks of the after-harvest season. A new cover of thick palm branches and palm leaves was set on the walls to protect them from the rainy day and the rainy season. Okonkwo worked on the outside wall, and the boys worked from within. There were little holes from one side to the other in the upper levels of the wall, and through these Okonkwo passed rope or tie-tie to the boys, and they passed it around the wooden stays and then back to him, and in this way the cover was strengthened on the wall. The women had gone to the bush to collect firewood, and the little children to visit their playmates in neighboring compounds. The Harmattan was in the air and seemed to distill a hazy feeling of sleep on the world. Okonkwo and the boys worked in complete silence, which was only broken when a new palm frond was lifted onto the wall, or when a busy hen moved dry leaves about her ceaseless search for food. And then, quite suddenly, a shadow fell on the world, and the sun seemed to be hidden behind a thick cloud. Okonkwo looked up from his work and wondered if it was going to rain at such an unlikely time of year. But almost immediately, a shout of joy broke out in all directions, and Umuofia, which had dozed in the noonday's haze, broke into life and activity. "Locusts are descending," was joyfully chanted everywhere, and men and women and children left their work or their play and ran into the open to see the unfamiliar sight. The locusts had not come for many years, and only old people had seen them before. At first, a fairly small swarm came. They were the harbingers sent to survey the land, and then appeared on the horizon, a slowly moving mass like a boundless sheet of black cloud drifting towards Umuofia. Soon, it covered half the sky, and the solid mass was now broken by tiny eyes of light shining stardust. It was a tremendous sight. Powerful. Beautiful. Everyone was now about, talking excitedly and praying that the locusts should camp in Umuofia for the night. For although locusts had not visited Umuofia for many years, everybody knew by instinct that they were very good to eat. And at last, the locusts did descend. They settled on every tree, on every blade of grass, and they settled on the roofs and covered the ground. Mighty tree branches broke under the weight of them, and the whole country became brown earth, the color of the vast, hungry swarm. Many people went out with baskets trying to catch them, but the elders counseled patience until nightfall, and they were right. The locusts settled in the bushes for the night, and their wings became wet with dew. Then all of Umuofia turned out in spite of the cold Harmattan, and everyone filled bags and pots with locusts. The next morning, they were roasted in clay pots and then spread in the sun until they became dry and brittle. and for many days this rare food was eaten with solid palm oil. Okonkwo sat in his hobi, happily crunching with Ikemifuna and Inwoye, and drinking palm wine copiously. When Agbuefi Ezeundo came in. Ezeundo was the oldest man in this quarter of Umuofia. He had been a great and fearless warrior in his time, and was now accorded the great respect in all the clan. He refused to join the meal, and asked Okonkwo to have a word with him outside. And so they walked out together, the old man supporting himself with a stick. When they were out of earshot, he said to Okonkwo, "That boy calls you father. Do not bear a hand in his death." Okonkwo was surprised and was about to say something when the old man continued. "Yes, Umuofia has decided to kill him. The Oracle of the Hills and the Caves has pronounced it. They will take him outside Umuofia, as is the custom, and kill him there. But I want you to have nothing to do with it. He calls you his father." The next day, a group of elders from all the 9 villages of Umuofia came to Okonkwo's house early in the morning, and before they began to speak in low tones. Nwoye and Ikemifuna were sent out. They did not stay very long, but when they went away, Okonkwo sat still for a very long time, supporting his chin in his palms. Later in the day, he called Ikemifuna and told him that he was to be taken home the next day. Nwoye overheard it and burst into tears, whereupon his father beat him heavily. As for Ikemifuna, he was set at a loss. His own home had gradually become very faint and distant. He still missed his mother and his sister, and would be very glad to see them. But somehow he knew he was not going to see them. He remembered once when men had talked in low tones with his father, and it seemed as if now it was happening all again. Later, Nwoye went to his mother's hut and told her that Ikemifuna was going home. She immediately dropped her pestle, which she was grinding pepper, folded her arms across her breast and sighed. Poor child. The next day, the men returned with a pot of wine. They were all fully dressed as if they were going to a big clan meeting or to pay a visit to a neighboring village. They passed their cloths under the right armpit and hung their goatskin bags and sheathed machetes over the left shoulder. Okonkwo got ready quickly, and the party set out with Ikemifuna, carrying the pot of wine. A deathly silence descended on Okonkwo's compound. Even the very little children seemed to know. Throughout that day, Nwoye sat in his mother's hut, and tears stood in his eyes. At the beginning of the journey, the men of Umuofia talked and laughed about the locusts, about their women, about some effeminate men who had refused to come with them. But as they drew near the outskirts of Umuofia, silence fell upon them too. The sun rose slowly to the center of the sky, and the dry sandy footway began to throw up in the heat that Jay buried in it. Some birds chirped in the forest. The men trod dry leaves on the sand. All else was silent. Then, from the distance, came the faint beating of the ikwe. It rose and faded with the wind, a peaceful dance from a distant clan. It is the Ozo dance, the men said among themselves. But no one was sure where it was coming from. Some said, Ezimili, others, Abame, or Aninta. They argued for a short while and fell into silence again, and the elusive dance rose and fell with the wind. Somewhere a man was taking one of the titles of his clan, with music and dancing and a great feast. The footway had now become a narrow line in the heart of the forest. The short trees and sparse undergrowth which surrounded the men's village began to give way to giant trees and climbers which perhaps had stood from the beginning of things, untouched by axe and bushfire. The sun breaking through their leaves and branches threw a pattern of light and shade on the sandy footway. Ikemefuna heard a whisper close behind him and turned around sharply. The man who whispered now called out aloud, urging the others to hurry up. "We have a long way to go still," he said. Then he and another man went before Ikemefuna and set a faster pace. Thus the men of Umosia pursued their way, armed with sheathed machetes, and Ikemefuna, carrying a pot of palm wine on his head, walked in their midst. Although he had felt uneasy at first, he was not afraid now. Okonkwo walked behind him. He could hardly imagine that Okonkwo was not his real father. He had never been fond of his real father. At the end of 3 years, he had become very distant indeed. But his mother and his 3-year-old sister, of course, she would not be 3 now, but 6. Would he recognize her now? She must have grown quite big. How his mother would weep for joy and thank Okonkwo for having looked after him so well and for bringing him back. She would want to hear everything that happened to him in all these years. Could he remember them all? He would tell her about Nwoye and his mother and about the locust. Then, quite suddenly, a thought came upon him. His mother might be dead. He tried in vain to force that thought out of his mind. Then he tried to settle the matter the way he used to settle such matters when he was a little boy. He still remembered the song. Eze, Elina, Elina, Sala. Eze, Ilikwa, Ya. Iktavaba, Aqua, Oligobli. Ebe, Danda. Nespi, Eze. Ebe, Zuzu, Nete, Egu. Sala. He sang it in his mind and walked to its beat. If the song ended on his right foot, his mother was alive. If it ended on his left, she was dead. No, not dead, but ill. It ended on the right. She was alive and well. He sang the song again. It ended on the left, but the second time did not count. The first voice gets to Chukwu, or God's house. That was a favorite saying among children. Ikemefuna felt like a child once more. It must be the thought of going home to his mother. One of the men behind him cleared his throat. Ikemefuna looked back, and the man growled at him to go on and not stand looking back. The way he said it sent cold fear down Ikemefuna's back. His hands trembled vaguely on the black pot he carried. Why had Okonkwo withdrawn to the rear? Ikemifuna felt his legs melting under him, and he was afraid to look back. As the man who had cleared his throat drew up and raised his machete, Okonkwo looked away. He heard the blow. The pot fell and broke in the sand. He heard Ikemifuna cry, "My father, they have killed me," as he ran towards him. Dazed with fear, Okonkwo drew his machete and cut him down. He was afraid of being thought weak. It's even harder if you read everything that happens between chapter 2 and chapter 7. That's a tough ending. It's a harsh lesson on the pressures that all societies create. That we make an arbitrary choice before children are even conceived. That there is a certain way they should grow to be and behave. And to be quite honest, that's where a lot of the confusion in the modern times comes from. Is good-intentioned parents, and I mean that, because even if things don't turn out the right way, the intention was still there, wanted their child, their children, their progeny to turn out the best they could be. But in trying to train them to do that in whatever way they tried to do it, you can't force a person to be something that they don't feel that they are. You simply can't. We can't create a world where we decide for people what they're going to be. It's okay to let children choose their path in life. You know, I one of my favorite genres, and I'm sure a lot of you as well, is watching children of different people groups make fun of their parents. You know, the mom with the flip-flop, or, the dad who always calls, his son a failure. The dad in the sunglasses who doesn't think his son could make a living as a YouTuber. All those are quite funny, but what's interesting is they're all the same story. It's so funny how, especially comedians and stuff, are like, oh, if you grew up in an Asian household, if you grew up in an Arab household, if you grew up in a Mexican household, if you grew up in a British, they were all the same. If you listen to them, like, we all have the same childhood. It boils down to our parents didn't get to be what they wanted, so you don't get to be what you want either. We're all forced to have this pressure on us to carry out our family's desires, the lineage, the name, in the way our family wants us to. Once in a while, parents show up who go, I see that my child has a talent for this. I shall encourage that talent and make you grow into to be something incredible and happy with that talent and gifting that you naturally have. Let's nurture that. But the vast majority of us are told to make good grades, behave a certain way, be what society expects you to be, and grow up and do something respectable. That's every society. Doesn't matter if it's in the middle of the jungle or the middle of New York City. Doesn't matter. Okonkwo, his father didn't live up to that expectation, and Okonkwo was going to be damned if he wasn't going to live up to the expectation and beyond. You would think over 3 years of raising a child, growing close to him, being proud of him, watching that young man have a positive influence on his own son, would endear him to that boy enough to save him somehow, to at least send him off into the woods with a sack of food and say, run that way, your village is 60 miles that way, just keep going, here's a machete, go. No, because even with such a character arc, even to grow to love that young man, he cannot escape what society expects from him. The old man was right. Okonkwo should not have been part of that moment. He should have left it to the others and not cared what they thought of him. Because now Okonkwo has done an incredible trauma to himself. He doesn't know it in that moment, but he has. He cared so much about what people would think that murder was okay. And basically murder of his own son. The boy was innocent. He wasn't involved in any of the things that happened. He was an innocent. Children are innocent. There is more that comes after that scene. And we see Okonkwo's next stage of the journey of how he reacts to what's happened. What he's done. What he allowed to happen. All of our society have rules. But sometimes those rules need to go. I mean, I'm kind of glad that slavery got overturned. That was a good thing. Kind of glad I can vote. Some rules need to go. I'm glad children don't have to, waste away in workhouses because they have the nerve to be orphans, Some rules needed to go. I'm glad we don't keep prisoners on ships in the middle of the ocean anymore. Right? There are some things that need to go. I'm not one of those people who thinks that just because something is, older tradition, it necessarily just automatically is wrong and needs to be done away with. But I think it's okay to re-examine things and go, that was a mistake. Let's do better. And that's what should happen in every generation. Not so much a tearing down every 20, 30, 40 years and rebuilding, but an examination. This may have served us well then. Does it serve us well now? And if it doesn't, we change it. If it does, we continue. But societal pressure is what it is. American youth will continue to be told that you must pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Youths in Japan will continue to be pressured to make the best grades on the planet. There is a young person in India right now whose parents are deciding who they're going to marry. Our societies have rules, and they have norms. They have ways that they expect us to be. Those rules and norms in and of themselves are not bad, but it's what ends up manifesting out of that. Is it trapping someone in a marriage that is unhealthy? Is it making kids work so hard in school that they need mental rest from exhaustion? Is it working so hard for that dream that America promises, but life has gotten so expensive that the dream will only ever be a dream? A book like this reminds us that we are all victims of societal pressure. And we can choose whether or not we are going to crumble under that pressure or we are going to bear the weight of that intensity. And even when it feels like it's pressing on us so hard we can't take it anymore, we go from a lump of coal to a beautiful diamond. You'll have to read the rest of the book to find out what that does to Okonkwo. But until the next time, I hope you enjoyed this something different. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And I will see you next time.